we are back. I'm here today with Madelyn Hoffman.
Hold on 1 second. It says it's setting up your meeting for YouTube Live. I don't know if that means we're live yet. So
it says it's now streaming live.
Okay. So everyone, thanks for joining us on KRTD News, Madelyn Fridays.
Hold on 1 second. It says it's setting up your meeting.
Doesn't say that on the screen I see. All right. I'll make sure we do this right.
It says it's setting up.
We're live. And Reef, you have to hide yourself.
I did. I'm hidden on my thing.
Not on the stream.
I know, but I don't know how to not. Let's do this. Let's stop video.
There you go.
And then hide non-video participants. And then there we go. That worked. All right. Good to know.
All right. Sorry, everybody, for the technical difficulties today. We're getting used to some new ways of streaming, but thanks everyone for tuning into KRTD News. Second week with Madelyn. We didn't do first week this month because there were 5 Fridays in the last month, and we did the first Friday on the 5th Friday. So, but today we got some really special stories for you guys. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So we have let's go to the first story. Madelyn, you want to start?
Sure. I don't know how many of you have been following this story, but it's pretty hard to ignore. It's a story began a couple of nights before Eid and the end of Ramadan in Jerusalem at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and then even a little bit before that, because there's a neighborhood in East Jerusalem where the Israeli Defense Forces, representing the Israeli government, is trying to evict and expel families from their neighborhood in East Jerusalem. So there are 2 things going on there at the same time: the expulsion of families from their homes, the interference with worshiping at Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the most holy sites for Muslims in Jerusalem. And then, just to add more to the story, the Israeli Defense Forces are once again bombing the heck out of Gaza. I mean, it doesn't take very much. It hasn't taken very much over time, much in the way of quote unquote provocation, for the Israeli Defense Forces to bomb Gaza. And I say, quote unquote provocation, because in general, the provocation is the fact that the Israelis are occupying Palestine, if you will, and that as the occupying force, the Israelis, the Israeli government, I should say, is not very kind and is doing things that under international law an occupier should not be doing. An occupier should not be making life worse for the people who live in, the occupied area. But this occupation has been going on for over 70 years. So these stories here, there's an update from Al Jazeera English. So far in the Gaza Strip, there have been 83 Palestinians killed. And this is just in the last several days. Okay, this is not over the last 2 years. It's not over the last 2 months. It's over the last several days. 83 Palestinians killed in the Gaza Strip as of a couple of days ago, or a day ago. And then that includes 17 children. And this particular photo underneath that update kind of says it all to me. You see the destruction in the background. You see people walking past what was, either a building they might have frequented or part of their house. And this is nothing new. And instead of, you see underneath it, instead of talking about a truce and a ceasefire, the Israeli ministers just voted to intensify the strikes on Gaza. And then always, the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli propaganda machine blames Hamas. And this is here again, Hamas is storing weapons inside of civilian buildings, says the Israeli Defense Forces. And then they say Hamas wants to put innocent Palestinians in harm's way. We urge you to stay away from these areas and get to safety. And then this kind of ambiguous line here, our goal is only to strike terror, right? So it could mean just sites that house something that could be considered by Israel as terror, or it could just mean we're just terrorizing the population, which is how I first read it and how I see what the Israeli Defense Forces are doing. And I say this, I just need to add this to my commentary here. I was not in Gaza, but I was on the West Bank in Palestine in 2013. I was there for 2.5 days. That's 2013. That's 8 years ago. I still feel like I was there yesterday. And I was traumatized from 2.5 days on the West Bank. And I can imagine if you live there on the West Bank or in Gaza, that the trauma is constant and the fear of bombs dropping is constant. And the children, who have lived through nothing but occupation and war, that's going to be permanent trauma for them. And it's the other thing I'll just add here in terms of the opening commentary is that oftentimes you read stories about this and you read it as it's conflict and clashes and war between the Palestinians and the Israelis. What they don't tell you is that the weapons that Hamas or that the Palestinians have are rocks, slingshots with rocks. There's no army, there's no navy, there's no armed forces at all in Gaza or the West Bank. And the Israeli government receives $3.8 billion annually from the United States that goes into armaments and such. So this is not a war. This is not a conflict between two even close to evenly matched sides. This is an occupation, massacre, genocide, because it is so seriously one-sided.
This would be the equivalent of, we can take the slide down now. This would be the equivalent of knights from medieval times going up against the US military.
Yeah, something like that. You might have a spear or a sword or something, but you drop one bomb and all of the knights gathered, that would be gone. And if you were a knight with a sword, you might be able to wreak some damage on
Right,
one.
let's take the slide down though for now. So yeah, so definitely is everybody aware that
I'm sorry,
Netanyahu just got through a corruption trial? I don't even know what happened with that, and he's still over there in power.
Yeah, he's been in power for many years now, and there's at least 3 or 4 elections that excuse me, 3 or 4 elections in the last.
So let's take a look at there was actually some good journalism done. So I was watching the State Department thing, and the State Department spokesperson, there were 2 journalists there, who are doing extremely good journalism. But this moron didn't know how to answer the questions. He was tap dancing around them.
Well, I'm sure he got marching.
We're speaking of the
orders.
principle of self-defense. We certainly.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred, but the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel.
Yeah, but do you think that an Israeli military response to the rockets coming in, a military response to the rockets coming in is covered by this broader rubric of self-defense, right?
Self-defense often does authorize the
Secondly,
use of
on
force.
this,
Thank you, Ned. I want to ask about East Jerusalem, but let's talk about what you said about the principle of self-defense. Does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
I'm in broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask you, I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Okay.
you're going to know as soon as I read what your answer was that there's a big problem with it. You said, well, not a problem, it just doesn't answer the question. We believe that it, meaning the right to self-defense, applies to any state. Well, you see the problem, right? Yes?
Do you want to?
Do you regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't
Do you
referring.
think that, do you don't in the context of the ICC and the UN. So are you saying that you do not, if it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or Palestinians in that case.
So they do have a right to self-defense.
Matt, I'm not
I'm not
in a position to debate the legalities
right.
from up here. What our message is one of.
So we have this. So in the comments, tell us who's the better tap dancer, the moron from the State Department, or what is his name again?
Fred Astaire.
Fred Astaire. So who's the better tap dancer, everybody?
Yeah, I would like to say this, Shane, about Ned Price from the State Department. He's saying exactly what he's trained to say. He may be, this is deliberate. This is not because he doesn't know how to answer. Can you imagine just going up to somebody randomly and saying to them or asking them, do you condemn the killing of children, and getting, what you expect is either a yes or a no answer. Do you condemn the killing of children? And he never said yes or no. Not once did he say yes or no. He said, well, we don't have the facts on the ground, they're just coming in. We don't have any verification. He's well trained. And you saw the reporter getting not frustrated, maybe, because he was, it's not unusual for this kind of answer to be given. But he kept pushing, he kept trying to get a yes or no answer. And
I think these two reporters, this is rare, but I'm really thinking these two reporters did journalism today, or that day they spoke there.
yes, they did. Yes, they did. But you see, if he, as a State Department person, said, I condemn the killing of children, then he and the United States would have to condemn the killing of Palestinian children.
Absolutely. Are you aware that there was a man giving an interview, the viewers, Are you guys aware? There was a man giving an interview on CNN. CNN never has the Palestinians on, but this time they did. He was telling them what was going on with the apartheid state, what was going on with the evictions, which, by the way, the UN has said are illegal evictions and
Yes.
could be constituted as war crimes.
Mhm.
Israel doesn't seem to care, but they
the United
dragged him
States
away. The
turns a
Israeli
blind eye.
Defense Force dragged him away after he finished his interview.
Yeah, I mean, it to pin the State Department down. There was also a question here about the International Criminal Court and the investigation that the International Criminal Court wants to begin into potential war crimes committed by the Israeli government and the IDF. And he didn't answer that either. You can't have a better cover. If you're Israel, you can't have a better cover than the United States for whatever crimes you commit. And I said earlier on that the Palestinians use rocks. They use rocks and they have these rockets, but it's certainly not in any way, shape, or form proportional to what the kinds of military hardware and military in general that the Israeli Defense Forces have. It's just there's no match.
It's like the equivalent of the US in the Iraq War.
Yeah, maybe even worse than that. But yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's probably true. They had technology. Palestine doesn't seem to have the level of technology.
And
that you
the
see in
and
Iraq.
the Iraqis have a military. It may not be as strong as, say, the Iranian military. Certainly not as strong or as many as the United States or the mercenaries that the United States leaves behind in certain countries. Palestine doesn't even have a military. The Palestinians have no armed forces. Period. End of sentence. So how do you stand up to a bully like the Israeli Defense Forces? How do you
Definitely.
do that without any armed forces? Maybe you try boycott, divest, and sanction. You try nonviolent ways of fighting back, and you're still criticized as Palestinians.
This is why I'm in favor of the BDS movement in the United States. The BDS movement to put economic pressure on Israel.
Yes.
To do the right thing.
Yeah.
Yes. They're not going to do it. It's basically the same thing with the Iran nuclear deal. The way we got Iran, the way that Iran made a deal with the way we got Iran to make a deal with us regarding nuclear weapons was financial pressure. That came to the table. It was different financial pressure, but nevertheless, finances play a big part in some of these deals. And the US could easily do something like that to Israel.
Well, that's what countries around the world who support the Palestinian cause are doing, putting economic pressure on. But here in this economic pressure on Israel to not profit from occupation in Gaza, the West Bank. But here in this country, there's a movement to make it illegal to support boycott, divest, and sanction, to make it, to criminalize taking that position. I think back to the bus boycotts in this country in the 1950s in the South. Boycotts in the United States are, they're a very common way of fighting back, and it's peaceful, it's nonviolent. It may cost people money and profit, but it doesn't kill anybody, it doesn't maim anybody. And
exactly.
The Palestinians are damned if they do and damned if they don't. They're damned if they use violence, and they're damned if they try to fight back non-violently. There's something wrong with that picture.
So let's also, the New York City mayoral race is something that's going on right now. New York de Blasio's term is going to be up soon. We're getting ready to elect a new mayor. There's about 30 candidates on the Democratic side, 2 on the Republican side, and then there's bunch of independents and write-ins, and I think 1 libertarian. I think, and then there's a few others who have possibly not announced, but we have 1 candidate in particular who responded to this. Let's go to the next slide. So the candidate who responded to this was Andrew Yang. And let's zoom in on Andrew's comment a little bit.
Oh.
Are we not able to zoom in on it?
It's pretty.
So Andrew Yang says, I'm standing with the people of Israel who are coming under bombardment attacks and condemn Hamas terrorists. The people of New York City will always stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel who face down terrorism and persevere. And he gets a response from Stephanie Iris Weiss. I think that's how you pronounce her name. She's an author. She says, as a proud Jewish New Yorker, please fuck all the way off with this vile pandering to the right-wing zealots when most Jews are repulsed about what the Israeli government is doing to the Palestinians. This is repugnant. And then I tweeted at Andrew Yang and I said, it's terrible what the right-wing authoritarian government of Israel is doing to Palestinians. The comment from Andrew Yang, disgusting. He just lost my vote for mayor in the primary and in the general. He can go fuck himself. So I said that, and everybody knows I'm an independent, but I did switch my registration to vote for Bernie in the primary. So I could still have voted for him in the primary. Not now.
Yeah, I mean, each candidate for mayor tries to outdo the other in terms of their pandering to Israel. I remember de Blasio doing exactly the same thing. But I mean, somewhere, someone, somehow has to be able to have the courage, a courage of conviction and the principles to say what's really going on there, and not just fall there, being in Palestine, Israel, and not just fall in behind, this blind allegiance to the Israeli government. I haven't said, this was a while back now, 2014, the last time I remember that the Israelis, the IDF, were bombing Gaza, and many more children were killed than this time so far. And I and 12 other people held a nonviolent civil disobedience action in front of Senator Booker and Senator Menendez's office in Newark. And what we did, we did a protest out in front, and then we went upstairs and we had tombstones made out of poster board, and we had a list of all the children that had been killed so far in that operation. I've forgotten what it was called. And we lined up right by the security desk. We started reading off the names of the children one by one, by one, by one, by one, by one, by one, until the security people had said, if you don't move, we're going to arrest you. And so the 13 of us got arrested and taken to police station in Newark. We were so dangerous, really. We had to be put into a jail cell for 5 hours. But politicians in this country do whatever they can, I think, to make the Palestinian, to dehumanize the Palestinians, and to not, look what just the State Department guy, Ned Price, he couldn't condemn the killing of children because
this is the one thing that I remember during the Democratic primaries, everybody was asked about Israel-Palestine.
yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, there was a smear article written about Bernie because he says that I support Israel and I support Palestine. And they're like, oh, no, you've got to pick one. And it has to be Israel. I'm like, really?
This
It
is
really
like,
doesn't.
no, it doesn't. And the thing is that there are years and years and years of propaganda that have been put out about this. And I tell you this because I mentioned earlier, I was in Palestine on the West Bank in 2013. And one of my conclusions was you can have people argue from now until 50 years from now, whose land is it? Who should, whose right is it to have that land? Go ahead. I know what I believe. But if you want to have that argument, go take it into a room somewhere, miles and miles away from what's going on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, because nobody should have to live the way that Palestinians are living.
Now, this is why, and a lot of people say, oh, you can't say this. I'll say it anyway. I think that it's time for a peace treaty to be signed, and you got to do. Now, this is something a lot of people pose, like, oh, how do we figure out who gets what? You do the two-state solution. Nobody's going to leave. Israel's not going to leave, and Palestine is not going to leave either. It's too late for any of that. You do a two-state solution. They get together, the leaders of Israel and Palestine. They create a treaty, and they decide, I get this, okay, but I want this. Great. You do all of that, and it can be done peacefully. But they're not. Nobody seems to be interested in peaceful solutions right now.
Well, nobody in the leadership of the countries does.
Well, nobody in the leadership.
Yeah.
Netanyahu has already said he
Netanyahu-
doesn't believe that Palestinians are citizens, and he said all kinds of racist things. Again, he just got through with a corruption trial. I don't even know how he got through that.
And I would say, Shane, from 2013 to today, the conditions on the ground make it harder and harder for a two-state solution to actually work.
Mhm.
Because for a two-state solution to actually work, you need to have water resources, you need to have land resources, you need to have all kinds of resources to sustain each state. The way it is right now, that land that was historic Palestine has been carved up into so many pieces that if a two-state solution were achieved, I'm not sure if the Palestinians could sustain themselves. So, and it's not the United States business to decide how, just like it wasn't the Brits' business to divide the land and the Balfour Declaration and set the Palestinians and the Israelis to fighting one another.
Exactly.
I think, I know we need to listen to the Palestinians, and my thinking is that they're now, that people believe that the only solution is a democratic one-state solution. Both solutions are, will take some time and negotiations, and either one, I should say.
Well, yeah, definitely. Anything they do is not going to happen tomorrow.
No,
and it's not going to happen with Netanyahu in leadership either.
No, it requires people to listen. It requires people to get off their, to lose their, I want to say the narrative that makes Israel into the perpetual victim. That narrative has got to go, because the Palestinians have a long story to share, and they could turn it around and say, I'm not going to call them victims, but they're the ones who've been living under the heel or the boot of this occupation since the very beginning. So these stories, I think Bernie said it maybe back in 2016, and like you said, he got some flack. He also shocked people when he simply said the Palestinians have to be treated like human beings. Can you imagine that being a radical statement?
There was an article written when he said that, because he's Jewish, as everybody knows. Traitor to the Jews or something by some right-wing publication. He's a traitor to his own people or something was the title.
Yeah, and I've been following some of these threads either on Facebook or on Twitter, And people are picking sides, like you said earlier, Shane, and it's like a football game. I'm standing behind Israel all the way. Let's stop it. This is not a football game. This is not a sporting match. These are people's lives. And when I got to the West Bank in 2013, one of the people who hosted me said to me he doesn't have a centimeter's distance or worth of space to breathe in. And I remember in the back of my mind thinking, well, that sounds like an exaggeration. And then I was there for 2.5 days and I realized he was absolutely right. You have people that are trying to live their lives with their children, their families. They're trying to live their lives and they can't breathe. They can't breathe, they can't move. They have to go through, he had to go through at least 6 checkpoints to get to the mosque where he prays. 6 checkpoints. And there's a huge checkpoint as you walk in and out of the neighborhood he lives in. Can you imagine, what young children think, having to go through this checkpoint with the soldiers going through their knapsack every day? It's just not, this is not a humane way to live. And this has got to be acknowledged by the international community. It's got to be.
I mean, the UN recently said that Israel is committing war crimes.
Well, yeah, I mean, and they always couch it. They say, we think, suspected, alleged, we think. But anybody who's there on the ground and anybody who's been there knows that, they're just saying that in order to protect, it sounds more objective to say maybe, alleged. But if you're there, I think you're absolutely right, Shane.
So definitely, we're running through the time. So let's get to our next story. The next story is about the former presidential candidate, Elizabeth Warren. She recently went on to Stephen Colbert's show the other day, and she made some questionable comments. Let's take a look.
Conventional wisdom on Joe Biden was that he was going to be very middle of the road, almost like a caretaker president, just sort of steady the ship and not do anything dramatic. Whereas, what did you run on? Big structural change. That's it. But this seems like big structural change, and I'm sorry, nobody expected that from him.
Well, all I can say is he ran on the most progressive agenda in decades. He said, not during the primary, but during the general, he said he was going to make a commitment to child care. He said he wanted to cancel student loan debt, or at least a portion of it. He said he was going to pay for his plans by putting bigger taxes on the wealthy and not on middle class and working families. And remember, Stephen, the world has changed from when the primary was going on. What's that been, 1.5 years ago? We've been through a pandemic, a racial reckoning, an armed insurrection. And now I believe America is ready for change. We've got our toes right on the edge of change. I think of this as policy is personal. I wrote this book to tell personal stories of my own and people I love, but also to lay out the direction we need to go. We have such an opportunity here, Stephen.
But will it happen?
Build an
because
America that works for everyone.
That would be lovely, but will there be the kind of change in the next months coming forward as we got in the first few months? Because the American Rescue Plan happened lickety-split by Washington standards. Infrastructure's been out there for a long time.
Not a long time yet.
Much longer than the ARP was out there.
100 days.
Okay.
We're in our next 100 days. And look, I'm fighting for change. There are a lot of folks who are fighting for change. And here's the thing to remember, Stephen. You remember how popular the American Rescue Plan was?
Yeah.
Indeed, Joe Biden said, Republicans come in, negotiate with me. They didn't want to do it. But it was popular across the country with Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And he said, that constitutes bipartisan. Let's go. Why was that plan so popular? Because it was progressive. look at all the pieces. It had a big chunk for childcare in it. It had money for vaccines, a government that was on the side of the people. It put money in people's pockets. It put money into unemployment insurance. It put money into small businesses to help them survive. It was popular because it was about a government on the side of the people and making an investment in businesses, in families across this country.
Now, let's talk about childcare for just a second. In the
Oh,
book,
let's
in
do.
your book, Persist, you talk about your own struggle to get childcare. What did you have to do to get the childcare you needed?
So, as you know, and I talk about in the book, I was going to be a special ed teacher, and I was teaching, hired for the next year, got pregnant, got fired. I'm home with a baby, and I decide I'm going to go to law school. So I make all my checklists. I got it all laid out what I'm going to do. And on that list is childcare. You cannot show up in contract law with a baby next to you.
Here you
So,
are. Here you are.
There I am.
There you are.
Exactly right. So at this point, Amelia's two, Alex, whom you see in the picture, is not yet born. He comes along a little bit later. And so here I am. I've got everything ready to go to law school, and I spend that summer looking for childcare. And it's just the classic. I can find a place, but it's 5 towns over. I can find a place that's closer, but it's got a waiting list that's months long. I can find a place that's closer and doesn't have a waiting list, but I can't afford it. It was one thing after another. Now, ultimately, I ended up 5 days to go. I found a woman who was just opening a little home-based childcare. She said she had space. I could afford it. It wasn't too far away. I looked down at the form, and the form says she only takes dependably potty-trained children. I look over at Amelia, who's not yet 2 years old. All I can say, Stephen, is I am here today as a United States Senator talking with you in part because of 3 bags of M&Ms and a cooperative toddler. Otherwise, it was all over.
So you got it done. You got it done in 5 days.
5 days.
But that's girls.
What can I say? Yeah, exactly right. Her brother, we're not going to talk about.
No. My boys are in their 20s and we're still waiting.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now we have, sorry, ma'am, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but think about that, Stephen. I came within inches of not being able to finish my education. I came within inches of having to quit my first teaching job over childcare. And that was 2 generations ago. My daughter had the same problems. And if we don't fix this, my granddaughter is going to have these problems. This is our moment. Childcare is infrastructure. You want people to be able to go to work, we got to have childcare in America.
Before we go, last question. It might be the most important question I ask you. Senator Chuck Grassley says he can do 35 push-ups anytime you want. Have you ever seen him do it, and do you believe him?
No, I've never seen him do it. And if Chuck Grassley says it, I'll believe him after he's done 34. I'll believe he can do 35.
All right, Chuck. Gauntlet is down. Get on the. I'll meet you on the floor. Her book, Persist. This one is available now. Senator Elizabeth Warren, everybody. We'll be right back with SEAL Team star David Boreanaz.
So, a couple things. This is a book of hers I won't be buying. I have 2 of her books. She wrote a great book called The 2-Income Trap, and then she wrote another good biography. This book is filled with excuses about why she lost the election, so I don't want it. But beyond that, Elizabeth Warren, the way she's talking, you can tell she doesn't believe a word she's saying when she says that Joe Biden is a progressive. You can tell she's kind of given up on her progressive values on her own. It's really that when a lot of people don't know, when she was a college professor, she did a study on bankruptcy. She publicly fought with Joe Biden when Joe Biden was a senator and she was a professor. There were all these public fights in committee where she was explaining why his bankruptcy bill would hurt so many people. She got the Clinton administration to reverse a bill by getting Hillary's support when Hillary was first lady. Hillary later voted for that bill when she was a senator, but that's another story. So she was doing a lot of progressive stuff before she was a senator. She shamed Barack Obama into creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau when she was a professor. She went on to MSNBC and she shamed him. Let's see what, but recently it's been really sad. She's been trying to make friends. She's been trying to go along to get along. It's not Elizabeth Warren from 5 years ago. Let's take a look at her from 10 years ago. This is Elizabeth Warren, MSNBC. She had a bill with John McCain.
I will push back, though, on the relative security that you're portraying Glass-Steagall to have given us, because Continental Illinois in the early 80s was the seventh largest bank in America. It failed, almost set off basically another major banking crisis. Shouldn't we just tell the American consumer that no matter what we do, there will be bank boom and bust cycles, no matter what the laws and regulations? You can't protect everything.
No, that is just wrong.
Why?
Look at the history.
I have looked at history. We're filled with booms and busts from the Dutch tulip crisis to now.
From 1797 to 1933, the American banking system crashed about every 15 years. In 1933, we put good reforms in place for which Glass-Steagall was the centerpiece. And from 1933 to the early 1980s, that's a 50-year period, we didn't have any of that. None. We kept the system steady and secure. And it was only as we started deregulating, you start hitting the S&L prices. And what did we do? We deregulated some more. And then you hit long-term capital management at the end of the 90s. And what did we do as a country? This country continued to deregulate more. And then we hit the big crash in 2008. You are not going to defend the proposition that regulation can never work.
I didn't say regulation never worked, Senator, by far and away. And I agree, there were fewer bank failures in that time after Glass-Steagall.
Fewer as in of the big ones, zero.
But Continental Illinois was the seventh biggest bank in the United States when it failed.
50 years.
Let's go to part 2.
Wow.
Let's go ahead and play that.
I will push back, though, on the relative.
Glass-Steagall would not have prevented the financial crisis.
Not all by itself, that's absolutely right. But what Glass-Steagall can do is it can wind some more of the risk out of the system. It can help bring down the size of the largest banking institutions. Don't forget, you said there was too much concentration in the banking industry in 2008. Now here we are in 2013, and the big four are 30% bigger. That puts too much risk back in the system.
Well, there's other ways of shrinking them, obviously. But
well, with all due respect, Senator, every report I've read, every person I've spoken to says that there's a very, very, very slim chance of this even passing.
Well, let me put it this way: if you don't fight for
Yeah.
It says if you don't fight for it, the chances are zero. It got cut off a little bit, but this is Elizabeth Warren in year 1. She teamed up with the Republican across the aisle, John McCain, to get Glass-Steagall reinstated, and she fought like hell for it. And then year 2, she really didn't. She started giving up slowly, year after year. She became more linked with. She tried to make friends with the establishment. How are you enjoying your cabinet position? Madeline, what do you think?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were waiting for something on how you're enjoying your cabinet position.
No.
No,
unless Warren is here to answer the question.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking she might say something. That's why I was silent. No, this just, to me, I mean, there's so much to respond to here when we're talking about banks and the economy and the crashes and the Joe Biden being the most progressive presidential candidate, in decades. I want to, and she talked about student loan debt and such. I mean, if you really look, okay, let me back up a minute. I remember when Bill Clinton ran in 1992,
Mhm.
He had very strong political rhetoric, but most all of that rhetoric turned into ashes after he was president for just a couple of months, a few months. And so the rhetoric that we hear from our presidential candidates has moved further and further to the right over these past 20 years, more or less, give or take. The problem is, or what makes Biden, makes some people think Biden is more progressive, is because of the way Trump was portrayed and the way, you know, the constant Trump, you know, that makes it that prevents the possibility of real discussion of issues. I loved listening to Elizabeth Warren here because she really was giving people information about the banks and how the banks operate. I really think, and you know, she's not going to agree with me because I'm a socialist, not a capitalist. She's not going to go that far, but she, at least when she was talking here, had a grasp on some of the really important issues. And when she calls Joseph Biden the most progressive presidential candidate in decades, I'm sorry. Anybody standing next to Donald Trump might look progressive, but student loan forgiveness, just a fraction of the whole 1 point something billion out of 1.376 trillion dollars of student debt. Where are the structural changes she's talking about? Yeah.
And also, when I don't know if you remember when Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden were in the primary, before Bernie dropped out, Joe Biden tried to appeal to the left by adopting Elizabeth Warren's bankruptcy bill. And he promised that he would bring it to fruition when he became the president. He's the president. He hasn't brought up your bankruptcy bill.
Yeah. And she doesn't say a word about that.
Yeah, and then what about those task forces with Bernie? What happened to any of those progressive compromises that were kind of watered down? But what happened to any of that? We haven't heard about the task forces. You remember Bernie and Biden went on a live stream together, like, and we got task forces and this and that. And I'm like,
Well,
task forces.
The Glass-Steagall, I mean, that was pretty common knowledge for the last 10 years, that we need to reinstate that in order to get back on some kind of solid ground with
And she's
banking.
given up the fight on that.
Yeah, she's, well, I don't want to specifically say, I don't want to say it's only her. I think it's the Democratic Party establishment leaving no room for people. If you say Biden is progressive, and I'll put that in air quotes, there's no room to move to the left. And this was what we were, you know, that some people on the left, the Green Party in particular, but others on the left, were saying throughout the 2020 presidential election. You know, that I mean, where is Joe Biden when it comes to the military? Where is Joe Biden when it comes to Palestine, Israel? Where is Joe Biden when it comes to Venezuela?
Well, Joe Biden spoke at AIPAC, so.
Yeah, I mean, and Kamala Harris has her arms wrapped around the Israeli people from now until whenever.
Definitely. And let's look at Elizabeth Warren. She slipped even further. So she used to be a serious policy person with the CFPB, with all this stuff. So here's Kyle Kulinski from Secular Talk breaking down a phone call between Pramila Jayapal and Elizabeth Warren during the primaries.
All right.
Let's take a look what he has to say.
Elizabeth Warren took some shots at the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. That's Representative Pramila Jayapal. Jayapal is to the left of Elizabeth Warren. And we just got this little nugget from Politico. This is fascinating, and it dates back to what was going on during the election, 2020 election. Soon after the debate clash, Liberal Representative Pramila Jayapal announced she would endorse Sanders over Warren. Jayapal later told others that she felt Warren had questioned her feminism when she called the Massachusetts senator to explain her decision, according to a person Jayapal told at the time. So Jayapal was even being a big person to call Elizabeth Warren to let her know, hey, I'm going to support Bernie. If I was in Jayapal's position, would I have called Elizabeth Warren to say I'm picking Bernie over you, Warren? No, I wouldn't have done that. Why do you owe her a phone call? Now, to be fair, I don't know how close their relationship is. Maybe they had worked together on some bills or something, and so there was enough of a rapport there or a relationship there where she felt like it was necessary. But that alone, I feel like, is a big thing of Jayapal to do. And if you're somebody who's on the left, it really wasn't a tough question. It was very clear that Bernie was the better candidate than Elizabeth Warren, especially after Elizabeth Warren started campaigning and showed how her focus is nowhere near on the correct issues and all these other problems. But Elizabeth Warren's response was basically to be like, oh, so I guess you're siding with the men over the women. That might say something about your solidarity and your feminism, Pramila. What do you want me to tell you? This is not good. I see what you're doing. You're going with the guy over the woman, and you're perpetuating the patriarchy. Seems pretty sexist. That's what that means. That's what that means. So here's why this story, I think, is important. Because what this tells me is it wasn't just that Elizabeth Warren was listening to her terrible staffers, and that's why she steered her campaign in the direction of away from economics, away from serious policy issues, and towards identity stuff. This tells me this is what she really believes. She actually has evolved or morphed her politics away from the person who helped give us the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and towards somebody who's going to endlessly, harp away on wokeness. There was some actual evolution there at some point, and it wound up with her questioning the feminism of the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who, by the way, is significantly to the left of Elizabeth Warren. Imagine being that kind of a person when you're told, hey, I'm going to go with Bernie over you. You get like really petty and vindictive, and you lash out in this kind of a way. It's just so sad. It really is. And it's amazing how far she's fallen. She went from one of the top contenders when she launched, because her reputation was that of somebody who was more on the left wing of the party and held Obama accountable on a number of issues, got into politics going after Joe Biden with, the bankruptcy bill and a number of other things. And then what she morphed into is just pure ego and narcissism, to the point where she'll accuse the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus of sexism for supporting Bernie over her, questioning her feminism. I guess you're not a great feminist because you're not picking me. By the way, on the actual issues, who would have been a better president for women, Bernie or Elizabeth Warren? Bernie, of course. And I'm sure that's one of the things that Jayapal thought of when she said, I'm going to endorse Bernie. He was a bigger fighter for issues that would impact women in a positive way. And so she picked Bernie over Elizabeth Warren, and this is how she reacted. Man, it's so sad what she became. It really is. It really is. And by the way, a lot of the people who she's going after at some point wanted her to run. Like Bernie wanted her to run in 2016. He didn't even want to run in 2016. He tried to get her in the 2016 race, and she refused to do it. And then fast forward to 2020, and Elizabeth Warren is accusing Bernie of being a sexist and not supporting and saying, like, female candidates can't win or whatever. Why would he advocate for you to run in 2016? He obviously thought you could win. So what are you talking about? Of course he can support female candidates. Of course he's not sexist. But again, this is what happened with Warren. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point Jayapal was urging her to run, maybe in 2016 along with Bernie. There were a number of people who were calling on her to run in 2016. But, there's also a deep sense of entitlement here, too. And I guess in Warren's mind, it's entitlement solely based on the fact that I'm a woman and you're a woman, Jayapal. But look at that. Look at that entitlement. You have to. You have to do this. You should do this. Of course, you're supposed to do this. And I'm sure Bernie's, when Bernie was pitching to Jayapal, hey, could you endorse me or whatever, I'm sure that it was, classic Bernie. Like, so I want to ask you something, but I'm a little bit nervous. I don't want to put any pressure on you, and feel free to say no, but would you please maybe consider supporting my campaign? I could totally see Bernie doing that in a typical, like, meek and nebbish way.
Nebbish.
That is classic Bernie. So anyway, Elizabeth Warren, every time a story comes out these days, it's always like super cringe fest and like shame on her.
Wow.
Sad.
Well, again, I certainly, there are a lot of things to say about Elizabeth Warren and the changes in her approach and her policy, but I'd take it a step further. It's the Democratic Party. It's the way the party squeezes out people on the left, the way that it uses people on the left, if you will, like Bernie Sanders, to bring young voters into the party, then squeezes them out of policy. And so for this to become a debate over supporting the woman rather than the man, it shows to me, well, I hear echoes of Hillary Clinton in the background and Elizabeth Warren going from challenging Hillary Clinton to being best buddies with Hillary Clinton. And it just goes to, is there within the Democratic Party, who's the progressive voice? And we can debate all night whether progressive is a word that we should even use anymore. I know, Shane, you've talked about it, that when it's co-opted by certain people, Joe Manchin, for example, it loses its meaning. And so, as a Green Party candidate, I'm looking at policies. I'm looking at policies in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, not the individual personalities, although there's certainly merit to doing what we just did here, but it's such a broader problem,
Definitely. And then the other thing is the Democratic Party will lash out at you if there were people during the primaries who said, I'm only going to vote for Bernie. If Bernie doesn't win, I'm voting third party or I'm sitting out. And they'll be like, how dare you? And I'm like, oh, like, that's ridiculous. And then there were some people, and then with Elizabeth Warren, her campaign, I watched her campaign. She had a great start saying, I'm not taking any corporate money, all that stuff. And then the Obama staffers entered her campaign and the Clinton staffers entered her campaign. And some Kamala staffers entered her campaign after Kamala left. And then you also, you get those staffers in your campaign, the Obama Clinton staffers, and then they steer your campaign into a certain way. I don't think that those staffers they came in the thousands, and they've done this to many progressive campaigns. They will come in and you're like, oh, Obama Clinton staffers, they must be geniuses. No, they're going to steer your they're going to run your campaign to the ground. They do this to progressives. They even do this to people who aren't even necessarily as progressive, like Beto O'Rourke. They did it he had an interesting Senate strategy. He was distributing a lot of power to the volunteers and letting them do things on their own. These people came into his campaign and said, don't let the volunteers do that.
Shane, how are you defining progressive?
I define progressive in two different ways. I think there are two different versions of progressive. There's the Elizabeth Warren progressive, who in theory believes in the right issues, but doesn't fight for them. And then there's the progressive, or I would say the Bernie Warren. I would even put Bernie in a different category, but I would say there's different degrees of progressivism. There's Elizabeth Warren's and Bernie Sanders, who are different degrees to the left, and they, in theory, they believe in the right things, but they won't do them, and they won't fight as hard. And then there's progressives who believe in the right things and are willing to fight for those issues. That's how I define progressivism, in two different tiers. And then I think there are degrees along the way of how progressive one is.
Well, and if you look beyond the Congress, if you look beyond the House of Representatives and the Senate, and you look into the streets, and you see people organizing.
Well, that's
Um,
direct action.
But
That
that's
could be
also
progressive.
that's as progressive as it comes, and or maybe there's a better word for it, maybe. But I actually had to respond to somebody in New Jersey who basically said, because there's no Democrat anymore that champions these issues like the way that some people would like to see, that progressivism is dead. And I challenged him. I said, there are Green Party candidates all over the country. There are socialist candidates all over the country. And then there are all the people in the streets, activism in the streets, despite the pandemic. You know, it has been and continues to be really strong. Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion. We got to do something about climate change and stand up to all these pipelines that are either proposed or in operation. You know, the Abolish ICE group, you know, that we can't continually detain people crossing the border and separate families and put them in detention centers for months on end simply because they come from a country south of the border. All these movements are really strong and growing, but who's speaking out for them in the
Now,
US
this
Congress?
is where I agree. This is what I mean. There are progressives, like the ones in the House and the Senate, who don't fight, but in theory they believe in the right things, which is nice, but that's not good enough.
No.
And we have progressives who are in the streets. We have other kinds of progressive candidates who are still fighting for these things. Now, the other thing, though, is everybody is a progressive when they believe in the right things. They get really put to the test, though, if they actually get elected. If you
Yeah.
actually get elected, you're put to the test, and you see how long you can hold out. Elizabeth Warren held out for about 2.5 years of her election of actually, after her election of actually fighting. I'm being generous there. And then she fought occasionally, and then she just stopped. Bernie fought a lot more when he was first elected too. It's a test. You got to see how long can you fight before you get tired, before you just want to make friends.
Well, and that's why I believe in independent politics.
Mhm.
That's why if there were someone in the House or Senate to the left of Elizabeth Warren, to the left of Bernie Sanders, if there were 5, 6, 10 strong voices from a party other than the Democrats and the Republicans, a party not controlled by corporate money, it would at least serve to start pulling on these Democrats, pulling on them from the opposite side of the establishment, corporatist, neoliberal Democrats.
So
But
could you see, let's say we had 12 Greens in the Senate,
Mhm.
and could you see them pulling Elizabeth Warren further to the left and Bernie Sanders further to the left and working on and pulling them, or do you not see that being a possibility if we have that?
Well, Elizabeth Warren said it herself in one of the clips you showed. If you don't fight for it, you'll never get it. I would love to see 12 Green Party senators in the Senate. I'd love to see the Green Party senators pull on the, middle of the road Democrats, or the Democrats that once had more fire and and now have given up, to use your terminology. I'd love to see what would happen if there were 12, because as you know, there's 100 senators, 12 people pulling in another direction. The problem is trying to get those folks elected, but people keep trying. And I think that I see it, I saw it as a candidate for US Senate. I saw that even when I didn't win, when I campaigned, even in the campaign, some of the issues, like the Green New Deal, came out right after one of the US Senate campaigns.
And then the other
Medicare
thing
for
is,
all. Mhm.
getting into the debates. For example, Lisa Savage, I'm not sure if well, you're probably familiar with her
I
campaign.
am.
She
Yeah.
ended up in the debates, and people actually got to see her go up against the Democrats and the Republicans. I think, but that terrifies them.
Yeah, you're right. It
Because
does.
the last two times, she was one of the first third parties to make it into the debate since the 90s, since Ventura and Perot,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken. That was 92 and 98 were the last times that a third party made it into the debate. And now the last time was 2020.
Yeah, and even there, she was in two of the debates, or maybe the first two or the first three, and then she was left out of the last one. The powers that be still were able to conspire to keep her out. So she did very well because of the visibility she had and because of the strength of her platform and her policies. But even with that, they had ways. The establishment had ways of keeping her off the out of the public's eye.
And that's unfortunate because we've seen how well third party candidates do when they actually get into the debates.
Yes, that's true. If the third party's on an equal playing field, treated as an equal partner, equal voice, it makes all the difference. And I think if you look at U.S. history going back to like the Henry Wallace campaigns and others, the stronger the voices are on the left, if you will, on the side of working people, closer to socialism and socialist policies, the more that the louder those voices are, the more the establishment feels like it has to respond.
There are 28 Greens that were elected in California in 2020.
Yes,
28
that's
Greens in
correct.
California.
That's correct.
And I believe there are a few thousand Greens across the country, if I'm not mistaken, in local seats. And then Vermont is my favorite example of when a third party gets to go. Well, in Vermont, there was a party that was started called the Vermont Progressive Party. It was started when Bernie was the mayor. And they started it because the city council kept voting everything he wanted to do down. So they started their own party and they started taking out people. They even got a lieutenant governor in there.
By taking out, you mean voting out, right?
Voting out. They started voting out.
Thank you.
So they started voting out people. And their lieutenant governor, and then they got a lieutenant governor in there. And they got so strong that when the lieutenant governor said he was going to run for governor, the Democratic Party had a choice. They knew they'd split the vote if they went against him. So they endorsed him. They endorsed a third party in Vermont. That's how powerful that party got. And they're afraid that could happen in other states.
Absolutely. And, there are people all over the country that are trying to make that happen nonetheless. And when we see strong voices in the Democratic Party become weak voices in the Democratic Party, it gives us even more impetus to do that, because if our voices aren't out there, they don't continue to speak up for some of these things. These
Definitely.
policies are Medicare for all, single payer health insurance, real Green New Deal, anti-war, and the wars and the occupation. Take the military spending and chop it up and give it to people, as well as put a tax on the very wealthy. If those ideas get silenced completely, then where will we be? And
Exactly. But
anyway,
looks like we're about 15 minutes over.
Okay.
Thanks everybody for tuning in today. Remember in the comments, who is the better tap dancer? The state house, the state, whatever. I forgot who he is now. I'm sorry, I'm losing it. The whatever, that guy.
Ned Price, State Department spokesperson.
State Department. The guy from the State Department, or sorry, my mind.
Fred Astaire.
Or Fred Astaire. Who's the better tap dancer? Leave it in the comments below. Maybe we'll put a poll. We're gonna put a poll out on Twitter later. So.
Oh, that sounds good. That's great. That's
and
great.
we'll put the
Let's
poll
do
on
it.
Facebook as well, so you can find it the poll at KRTD Media on Twitter or the KRTD Media Facebook page. We're going to put the poll out by tonight.
Sounds great. Shane, thanks as always for